It can be so easy to draw in the criticism and judgment of others and take it as our own. But if we would instead choose a way of compassion, we might find our way a little bit closer to the center of calmness. Good evening and welcome to another episode of Center of Calmness. And tonight we have Dimple DeBalia with us from Roots in the Clouds. Welcome, Dimple.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Now, I'm very curious at first just to hear how things are with you in the Virginia area. How is everything going for you?
It's a little bit crazy. I think probably what most people are experiencing, except we're kind of in the heart of all of it. And so it gets to be, but I don't know, this time is a little bit different because we're still working from home. And so there hasn't been as much of going back into DC or anything like that. And so, but yeah, I mean, we're dealing with summer storms and, things moving on, even though it just feels very, very odd these days. So
exactly, super surreal, right? And then I guess there's an election coming up, right?
Heard something about that.
If you could,
no, but in all seriousness, please vote.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely planning to do that. It's super necessary at this time to make the right choice. So I'm curious as to how you got into the concept of compassion. I wonder if you could just take us through your journey as to how you reached the MD training and what got you motivated to get into that.
Yeah, sure. So I've been practicing mindfulness on and off since I was a child, but I didn't really understand the value of it until really the last few years. And so my own personal story was that I've worked in the crossroads of kind of the government and humanitarian sectors for the last 15 years. And in that work, I would often go out into the field, so around the world, different countries, interviewing refugees for resettlement to the United States. And then part of that was also interviewing asylum seekers here in the United States for asylum. And it was an incredibly fulfilling job. I really just got so much out of meeting the people that I got to meet. And it was humbling, to know that you are listening to the story of this person sitting in front of you, and you have the impact or the ability to potentially change their lives. And so about 7 years into my job, I started having symptoms of vicarious trauma. And so I was on a trip in Zambia. I was interviewing refugees from Rwanda and Burundi and the Congo. And it was the first time in my life that I started to have nightmares. And I was really just having a hard time with my own emotions in the interviews. And mental health is something that people just don't talk about in general, and especially not, in the workplace. And so it was just one of those things where I kind of shoved it down like most people do, and you keep moving forward. But I knew that there was something bigger going on. And so I started doing some research, figured out that, I was probably experiencing vicarious trauma. And then after a while, it occurred to me that if I was experiencing this, other people probably were too, who do the same kind of job. And so as a result, I was lucky enough, fast forward a little bit, to land in positions where I could actually affect change. And part of that was trying to destigmatize mental health and start that conversation in the workplace to say, look, this is just a reality of what we deal with. It's an occupational hazard. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. And so in doing that work, I was very fortunate to be linked up with a resilience committee that was within the government. And so through that, they ended up they signed a contract with UC San Diego Center for Mindfulness. And I was lucky enough to bring some of those mindfulness pilots to my organization, and along the way had the opportunity to attend as well. And it was just incredibly impactful. There's a part of what we do in this course is what we call a mindful hike. And I remember when I got into the course, it was like I was surrounded by all these elite athletes and law enforcement officials, and I was like, I don't belong here. And the hike was just really empowering, and it helped me, and a lot of it was using these techniques of really honing in on that internal chatter that's going on in your head that tells you like, I can't do this, or I don't belong here. And learning to kind of push past that to really achieve your potential. And so I found the whole experience incredibly motivating, and so much so that I asked to get trained, and am now able to offer it to others.
That's awesome. So I wonder if we could back up for just a moment and help the audience understand a bit more about what vicarious trauma really is. I think a lot of folks may have experienced it, but may not understand that terminology. I wonder if you could, I hesitate to say give an illustration, but get the audience a little bit closer to what that concept is and how it impacted you.
Sure. So trauma is actually, like, trauma in general is actually so common. And, I think many of us when we think of trauma, we think it has to be like some big, overwhelming experience. But the reality is, you can think of trauma my friend Kristen says, you can think of it as a layer cake. And so in our day-to-day lives, we have, everyday normal stressors that we're experiencing in terms of, things like waking up late, or, a bad commute, things that just kind of get under our skin. And then your next layer is going to be just like an added layer of kind of chronic stress that builds up over time. And especially in this country, we're not really great about taking vacation days or really practicing good self-care. And then on top of that, you've got organizational trauma. So this is whatever's happening within your organization. And then on top of that, you can add in like pandemic, job loss, like there's just so much stuff. And so trauma is something that gets built up. But the traditional definition of trauma was very much focused on kind of those individual incidents that happen to a person. So, anything from the death of a loved one to, actually being physically attacked. And, the defining line was that trauma changes your perception so that it divides life up into what life was like before the event happened and after the event happened. And so when you work in a field, so whether it's in like international humanitarian work, or like a lot of the doctors and nurses who are out there on the front lines right now with COVID, first responders, when you're in these professions where you're witnessing the trauma that others are experiencing, over time, you can start to kind of take that in, and it can start to impact you in different ways. And so we call that vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. So it's not that you yourself are experiencing the trauma, but that you can actually, like, it's something that relates to you, like you relate to it far more than others. And so with vicarious trauma, it's things like, you may have nightmares, or you may have trouble sleeping. You may end up using all kinds of things to numb your, like numbing things. Like that's where we see a lot of like alcoholism or drug use, workaholism as well. So any kind of ism is right in there. You can, it impacts your relationship. So sometimes like you can't really connect with others on a level that you normally would be able to. There can be some depression. So there's a lot of different signs and symptoms, and it all is dependent on each individual. So, it depends on kind of your own, what happened in your life when you were growing up, that kind of stuff that travels with you. And then also just any other kind of stressors that you have in your life now. And so it's a whole combination of things. And so it impacts everyone in different ways, but there are definitely some particular things, and especially people who are working in these professions that witness other people suffering on a regular basis, are much more susceptible to it.
Definitely understand that. So is it largely a matter as far as the vicarious nature comes in? I understand the kind of, I would say, hidden trauma that we carry, and then that can be triggered or amplified by witnessing trauma in others, especially in these humanitarian situations. Is it a matter of those other individuals, say refugees, for example, the stories they tell, or is it a matter of witnessing and being actually a part of or close to the trauma that they're actually experiencing?
I mean, it can be both, right? So we see like a lot of our members of the military who are out in the theater right now, who have witnessed things. They experience post-traumatic stress. And so that's a little bit different from vicarious trauma, but there's elements that can be similar. But yeah, I mean, listening to stories of torture and persecution day in, day out, hour after hour, it can have the same impact, or maybe not the same, but similar. And so it just depends, again, on how you take it in. I think people who are incredibly empathetic and, and in this field, like many people are so service oriented and so mission oriented that, they want to know what they can do to serve. And so when you're in that place and you have that empathy, it's easy to kind of, even as you're sitting there listening to a story, when you hear enough of these stories over time, it can definitely have an impact.
I certainly understand that. And then I just wanted to shift briefly to the concept of mindfulness, which I think is not well understood by most. And I'm particularly curious, you mentioned that you've had experience from an early age of mindfulness exercise or participating in or being able to achieve a level of mindfulness. I wonder if you could take me all the way from the early stage of your understanding of mindfulness to what you understand of that technique today.
Yeah, sure. So, I think there are a lot of misconceptions about mindfulness. And so, mindfulness and meditation are often interchanged, like the words are interchanged, but meditation is a form of mindfulness. So mindfulness at its very core is a way of being in life. And so it's that ability to have awareness, to have compassion, so that you can actually regulate your own behavior especially in times of difficulty. And so when I was growing up, it was very meditation focused. And, when you're young, and especially in the time when I was growing up, it wasn't as common as it is today. And so trying to sit down to meditate, I actively use that time to daydream and do other things. And it wasn't until just this last few years where I've really started to understand more of the science behind it, to really see, learn about the studies that have been done to show, what the brain of a long-term meditator actually looks like as compared to someone who doesn't meditate, and why it can help us gain greater focus and better concentration. And so that's kind of been my trajectory, but really understanding that mindfulness comes in so many different forms. And so meditation is the formal practice of mindfulness. But, you can be mindful in everything that you do. And it's that idea of being present in this moment. And what's crazy is that most people don't realize it, but we're really only ever present in a conversation about 47% of the time. And this is based on a research study that was done, which is nuts, because that means that if you're sitting down with someone to have a conversation like we are now, like, right. You catch about 50% of what's happening. And, we don't want to do that. Like most of us want to really try to be present, and it's hard, especially now with gadgets and social media and everything else. Like it's so easy to get distracted and that kind of thing. And then the other thing is that in times of crisis, like we're in right now, that 50% goes down even, or the 47% goes down even more, or goes up, so that the the stress and anxiety of the crisis situation actually reduces our ability to really tune out the mental noise by up to 80%. And so, I mean, that's pretty phenomenal when you think about it. And so, you think about things that we're doing every day, like driving or taking care of children or, whatever it is that you do in your work or at home. And to know that you're not really present for a lot of it is a little bit frightening. So
a little bit, yeah, definitely can be an issue, especially in a dangerous situation. I wonder if I mean, I don't want to delve too much into what you're offering in your program per se, but I wonder if you might be able to offer the audience something simple that if they realize they've drifted off and they're kind of in that now it's not 53%, but it's probably closer to 70% disconnection mode, how they might bring themselves quickly back into a conversation, or if they got briefly overwhelmed in a group meeting or under some kind of stress, how they could quickly snap back into the moment.
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for kind of mentioning MPEAK. So MPEAK is it's a course, mindfulness, performance enhancement, awareness, and knowledge. And it's really about exactly what you're saying, like how do we integrate this concept of mindfulness into our day-to-day life. And so, for example, conversations are a great one, right? So you can be talking to someone or you can be in a meeting and completely tune out like what's being said.
Exactly.
And then you get called on, right? And somebody says, well, what do you think? And you're like,
Oh.
So obviously in that situation, you would maybe politely say, oh, can you repeat what you were saying? But part of, what we work on through the MPEAK is being able to notice that that's happening quicker so that you don't get to that point where now you've completely missed 5 minutes of the conversation and you have no idea what was talked about. And so we want to hit it at like 1 minute. So at 1 minute where I'm going to say, oh, you know what, I'm tuning out, I need to refocus. And so part of that is, we talk a lot about the stress reaction, and every single one of us has a stress reaction that has several steps that we go through multiple times during the day. And what mindfulness allows us to do is it allows us to engage in what we call mindful responding. And so most of us operate on autopilot through a good chunk of the day. And so when we're operating on autopilot, we're reacting. And we want to get to a point where we're intentionally responding, because that's where you have a little bit more control over, how you're responding. And so part of this is really just about introducing a few simple concepts. And so the first thing that we introduce to create a cycle of mindful responding is self-awareness. And so self-awareness is just that ability to quickly tune into our thoughts and to also correspond to where we notice any kind of a stress reaction in the body. And so oftentimes the body knows that something is wrong or that we're upset or whatever before our minds actually catch up. And so the quicker that we can learn to tune into what's happening in the body and correspond that with our thoughts, the quicker you can, that's kind of the self-awareness that we're talking about. So as soon as you're able to notice that, you're already back in the present moment. And that's where we want to be. And then from there, we introduce self-compassion. And so self-compassion, we have a lot of reactions in how we react. So there's 5 key things that we do. We've all heard of fight or flight. So there's fight, flight. There's freeze, fix, or fake. And so fight is pretty obvious. It's either where you're blaming, you're shaming, you're judging. And a lot of the times that stuff is turned towards ourselves. It's not even that you have to be doing it towards somebody else. Flight is where we either physically get up and leave the space, or, again, going back to that idea of numbing or, getting really involved in our work, or just finding ways to get yourself out of that situation mentally or physically. Freeze is where it's just that paralysis by analysis. You can't make any decisions. Fix is where you're kind of like, well, if I can do this, so like if I can lose 10 pounds, I'd be more lovable. Or if I can just do, produce like 2 more papers, I'll be more valuable to my organization. So we do a lot of like kind of if I can do this, then only will this happen. And then fake is where we don't want to show any vulnerability. This is where our perfectionist tendencies come out. And we just want to show the world that we don't need help and that we can do everything. We're perfect. And it's just not a sustainable way to live. And when we engage in perfectionism, we can't, we tend to take fewer risks because we're afraid to fail. And so this is where, because of these reactions, we want, number one, we want to be able to notice how we react in certain situations. So that we can change that. But the other part of that is we introduce self-compassion. And so when we talk about self-compassion, we're talking about meeting any kind of pain or difficulty with kindness. And so if you think about how you speak with a friend who's going through a difficult time, we rarely do that for ourselves, right? And so the things we say to ourselves, I mean, most of us would not say to any other human being. And so self-compassion is very much about turning that kindness to ourselves. And there's a lot of misconceptions about self-compassion that like, oh, well, if I practice self-compassion, I'm just not going to be as motivated. And, I have to be really hard on myself to really get out there and succeed. But the research that's coming out of UT Austin, Kristen Neff, she's a researcher on self-compassion. And the research that her team is doing has really shown that people who regularly practice self-compassion are just as motivated as people who choose to go a different route, but that their work is correlated with less in terms of what would be considered failures, or and it's just because they're not as hard on themselves about it. Like if they mess up something, they are like, okay, you know what, I'm going to try again and keep going. And so that self-compassion piece is really important. And so once you have the self-awareness and the self-compassion, that leads to self-regulation. And self-regulation is the point at which we make a new decision. And so we have this cycle of conditioned reactions. And so we go through the day and we make decisions and we react in kind of conditioned ways that have come up since we were children. They were like, they've been established since then. And so with the conditioned reactions, if you're not mindful, you just continue to do that. And then, you make the same choices over and over again. So mindfulness is what allows us to notice like, okay, I'm in this situation again. Here's how I typically react, but now I can change like what I believe about it. I can change the story I'm telling myself about it, and I can make a new decision. I can self-regulate and change that pattern. And all of this relates directly to, there's so much brain science behind it, the neuroscience and neuroplasticity. So it shows that, the conditioned reactions come because in our brains, we have certain neural pathways that are already formed. And the more that we continue to just operate on autopilot, the more those neural pathways they're just deepened. And so when we're in a default situation, our brain will default to what it knows. And that's why we make that same choice. And so the more recent neuroscience shows, though, that we can create new neural pathways. And that's really exciting because that means that our ability to self-regulate, and the more that we can practice mindfulness, the more that we can make these choices intentionally, the more we can build new neural pathways, so that when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, instead of defaulting to that way that doesn't serve us, we can start to create a new pathway so that our brain will default to that instead.
That's completely awesome. I really appreciate the compassion element with the kindness. And I was very happy to hear that in the research, there's no loss of performance, choosing kindness over criticism. And to me, that's completely awesome. Of course, criticism is the go-to, right? But through kindness and through just giving yourself a little space to take another shot at something if there's a failure, that's completely awesome. Now, if I understand, did you go through the MP training yourself?
I did, yeah. So I went through it.
Did you find?
Sorry?
I'm sorry to interrupt. What kind of results did you find as you experienced it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I went through it a little over a year ago myself, and for me the biggest issue really was the kind of inner critic, like that often negative self-talk. And so, like I was saying, when we went on this mindful hike, I was just like, when we drove up to the mountain, I was like, yeah, I can't do this. My mom had just passed away like a couple months earlier, and I hadn't been working out, and I just wasn't feeling great about, where I was. And it was just a lot of different things. And I was like, I can't do this. Like, look at all these people, they're going to run up this mountain. And so there was already this comparison and this, like, I just can't do it. Like all these things that I was walking up to the starting point with. And when we got there, our instructor said, okay, so, this hike is going to be in silence. You're not going to talk to anybody. And I want you to just listen to your thoughts, and I want you to listen to your body. And those are your only instructions. And when you get to the top, you have to stop and really savor that accomplishment and look back, because that's the other thing we forget often is we're so busy trying to get to whatever our goal is that we get there, and then we don't take the time to really enjoy it or celebrate it, and we're on to the next thing. And so those were the only instructions. And like I said, right off the bat, I felt myself comparing myself to others and really just thinking like, there's no way this is going to be so hard. And probably about 3 or 4 minutes into it, I was like, okay, wait, let's stop and think back to what the instructions were. And I really started to just listen to my own thoughts, and I really listened to my body. And so it was hot that day. And, when I needed to stop, I just stopped. And if I needed water, I drank water. And so it was the first time in a long time that I've been on a hike that I wasn't dehydrated. But also it was like, we also kind of had talked about looking at this challenge as also, comparing it to how we deal with other challenges in our life. And so as I was moving forward, I was thinking like, is this what I do? Like, do I get to a certain point and then feel like this is going to be too hard and maybe I need to turn around? And so I started looking at each switchback, and I was like, all right, I'm just going to get to the end of that switchback. And if I don't want to do it, I'll turn around and I'll go back. And that's what I did the whole rest of the way. And I made it to the top. And it just felt so, like, I just felt amazing having done that. And just knowing that by tuning into, what I was telling myself and kind of disputing that to say, well, you know what, that's not necessarily the case. Let's try it anyway. And also listening to my body. And so, my body was not saying like, I can't do this. My body was like, yeah, I'm okay. Like, you can keep going. And
Nice.
So just that little bit of being able to tune in made all the difference. And so what I find for myself now is that, especially as we're dealing with COVID and everything else, like my levels of compassion and self-compassion are so much higher, and it's changed everything. It just changed how I show up at work, how I show up in my relationships. And it makes a huge difference. And so it has been so transformational for me personally, which is why I just really want to share it with other people. So.
I'm super glad you share that. It's quite a story. And what's really cool is that you actually have a class of your own coming up, right?
I'm sorry?
If I understand right, you have a class of your own coming up, right? A new cohort that you're starting.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. So I have a cohort starting on Saturday, which I'm really excited about. And I have 2 slots left in that cohort. And I am actually offering it at half off the regular rate, which is the only time I'm ever going to do this. But I really wanted to get people in there to really experience kind of what I experienced. And so, or what I'm hoping what I experienced. But yeah, it launches on Saturday and registration closes tomorrow. So there's still time and 2 slots. So.
Excellent. A brief but powerful window at of course, a price that likely will not be repeated. So for anybody listening out there, and I'll be sure to boost this as well to make sure that my audience is fully aware of the opportunity quickly so that they have the best chance to get involved. And I've included the information there for Dimple below. www.rootsintheclouds.com/mpeak. That's M and then the mountain peak. And then for folks that are listening to this on cast later on, of course, I'm sure that Dimple will be setting up additional cohorts as this goes on and sharing this method of, can I just call it mindful self-compassion? Would that be accurate?
Well, so it's actually, mindful self-compassion is actually a thing, but I would say it's more based in traditional mindfulness-based resilience training or stress reduction. Sorry, mindfulness-based stress reduction, so MBSR. But yeah, so that's really what it's actually the foundation of it.
Resilience training sounds, for me, it sounds even better. That's awesome. I'm glad you joined us here at Center of Calmness. For a bit here, I really appreciate you've shared a ton of value with us, and thanks for joining. And I hope to direct as many folks as we can to your training at rootsintheclouds.com/mpeak. Thanks
Thank
again
you so much for having me. Yeah, thank you.
And for the Center of Calmness, I'm Derek Warner.